All right, so Dred Scott and the election of 1860. These are two of the things that are kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. So in 1857, a slave by the name of Dred Scott, moves with his master to the state of Illinois. Okay, his master suddenly died, and some people started suggesting to Dred Scott that he should be free rather than sent back to his family, to his master's family in Missouri. So eventually the case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court because nothing like this had ever been discussed before. Okay, so typically slaves were treated as property. Okay, so just like any property would be bequeathed to someone or given to someone upon the death of a master, sometimes slaves were freed upon a master's death, but the whether it was because he died so suddenly or just because of his personal views, Dred Scott's master did not free him upon his death, and it became this whole huge legal battle. Okay, the majority of the Supreme Court judges at the time, were Southern sympathizers. Okay, so essentially what they rule is that Dred Scott is still a slave because slaves are property. And the Fifth Amendment protects personal property. So even if popular sovereignty outlaws slavery, slaves are still allowed legally because they're property, and that is protected under the Constitution and not just popular sovereignty. Um, Essentially, they ruled that as an African American, especially a slave, Dred Scott did not have the ability to bring the case before the court. They essentially completely ruled against him, ruled that slaves were indeed property, like a horse or any other possession. Um, the biggest problem with this to Northerners, they were the abolitionists were used to Southerners thinking that slaves and even freed African Americans were less than um, other people. But the biggest issue that they had was essentially that a Southern slave owner could theoretically, under this decision, bring their slaves from Tennessee and bring them to New York. And since they were considered property, they would still be allowed in New York. Well, New York was a free state. So essentially, this ruling by the Supreme Court means that slavery can go anywhere in America. So the questions for this, why did Dred Scott feel he should have his freedom, was essentially that they were in Illinois and a free state when it happened. So that is the answer to number one. It was that they were in a free state or Illinois. Who would be upset over the Supreme Court? Some of you were combining from here up and here down. Okay, so here, where it starts a year later, I can't get this highlight, is all about the election of 1860. Everything up is about Dred Scott. The thing that links them together is that Lincoln does bring up this case whenever he is debating with Stephen Douglas, the one that wanted the railroad in Bleeding, Kansas. And he brought up this case and essentially asked Douglas which should be more important, the court's ruling or popular sovereignty. And whenever Douglas said that he preferred popular sovereignty over the court's decision, that's when he started losing votes. Okay, so number two, who would be upset over the Supreme Court's decision regarding Dred Scott would not be Lincoln. I mean, in some respects, I'm sure at a personal level, Lincoln was upset by this. He never ran as an abolitionist. I have seen things where he is both kind of an abolitionist and where he just kind of thinks of slavery as a necessary evil at the time. Whether that was for political reasons or not, I don't know. So, who would be upset? The answer to this one would be the North, okay? Especially Northern abolitionists. And the reason why they would be upset is because essentially this ruling allows slavery to go anywhere in America. Why did Stephen Douglas lose support from the Southerners? I just said that when Douglas said that he opposed the court's decision and preferred popular sovereignty to decide these kind of things instead of the Supreme Court, that's when he lost a lot of support from the South. Um, the election of 1860, I'll go into more depth later, but essentially, there were a lot of candidates. Okay. 1860 was a very rough time. As you can see, and as we've been talking, discrepancies over slavery or free abolition, anti abolition is getting increasingly difficult. Both sides are digging in their heels. It is literally on the brink of a civil war. We're talking about 1860. Um, Fort Sumter, which is typically considered the first battle of the Civil War, is in 1861. So there were four people running for president. Okay, there were Northern Democrats, there were Southern Democrats, and the Democratic Party was completely split over slavery because half of them, the North obviously, were anti slavery and the South was pro slavery. They needed someone in the middle that could win. So Lincoln was kind of the perfect in the middle candidate. He easily won. Okay, this is question number 4. He easily won because the Democrats were so divided. And Lincoln was not necessarily running on an abolitionist platform. He was not promoting abolition as a presidential candidate, but he was running on limiting the expansion of slavery in the West. So he pretty much said in his campaign speeches that he would leave slavery where it existed, but he did not want it to spread. So because he was kind of a middle of the road candidate, he ended up winning. Now, this was a little bit different, and the South, and this doesn't really go into this reading, doesn't really go into this, but I did want to mention it. The South hates him. Um, Lincoln did not campaign anywhere in the South. He did not win a single state in the South. Um, and he did not even win the popular vote. Okay. Lincoln became president because he won the most electoral votes because he won most of the North. And electoral votes are based on population. Since most of the population was in the North, Lincoln ended up winning the election. So after this, and after Lincoln gets elected, the South start, the Southern states start preparing to secede, which is to separate from the Union. South Carolina is the first state to do this. And the reason why they secede essentially is because they feel like they don't have a say in politics. Okay, so a president just won. And I know I'm not trying to make the South out to be the good guys, but put yourself in their shoes for a second. The president that just got elected by math, essentially not by popular vote, didn't campaign, didn't win a single state majority in the South, and was more pro North than pro South for sure. So by the time he gets inaugurated, um, South Carolina has seceded, and Fort Sumter happens not too long after. And again, Fort Sumter is essentially the first battle, if you will, of the Civil War, which we'll get into here soon. So Lincoln, as soon as he becomes president, really has an uphill battle. Okay, so he, in one of his speeches, is essentially begging the Union to stay together, um, trying to get people to look past their differences, to try and make some more compromises. But I think we've talked about more than enough compromises. Popular sovereignty obviously didn't work as the case in Kansas. So Lincoln really, really struggled. So, number 5, if Stephen Douglas had not lost Southern support and won the election of 1860, would the Civil War still have started? And why? So, a lot of you said that if the South would have won, it just kind of would have prolonged the inevitable. Um, some people said that it wouldn't have, or it could have had the opposite effect and had essentially more slave states eventually. So again, as long as you put down actual critical thinking, you gave me a couple of sentences, I gave you full credit. So there is your answer sheet for, well, answer video for all of these with a little bit more background information. I'm probably going to go ahead and do this for the notes just in case, just so you guys can kind of get a little more info if you would like. So there are your answer keys. And let me know if you have any other questions. Don't forget, you can reach me via email. You can reach me via Hangouts. We can set up a time to do a quick meet or a video hangout or at least a voice hangout if you want. So please let me know how I can help you. And thanks for listening.